The day I found an old adoption certificate. There's no record of this child, the agency said. But when I showed my parents, they finally told me about the baby they lost. I don't know where to begin. My life was, up until this point, pretty average. I'm 39, single, and live in Louisville, Kentucky. My parents, Nadine and George, are still around, retired, and generally the type to keep things low-key. They've lived in the same old house for over 40 years, and I spent most of my childhood thinking that there were no real secrets in our family. But I was wrong. So very wrong. This happened last year. My parents had decided to sell their house to downsize. It was too much for them to maintain at their age, and with the housing market booming, they figured it was the right time. I offered to help them clean out the place. Honestly, I thought it would be an excuse to sift through old memories. I expected to find dusty yearbooks, some childhood toys, maybe even embarrassing photos of myself. What I didn't expect was to stumble upon something that would turn my entire understanding of my family upside down. It all started when I was clearing out the attic. It was hot, stuffy, and smelled like decades of neglect. I was moving boxes when something fell out from behind an old trunk. It was an envelope, yellowed and brittle, with my parents' names written on it in cursive. The paper looked so fragile I was almost afraid to touch it, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened it carefully and pulled out what looked like a legal document. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was an adoption certificate. But the name on it wasn't mine. It read, Edith Mooney. The date was April 12, 1978. 3 years before I was born. I stared at it, my mind racing. I only had one sibling, my older brother Dale, who died in a car accident when I was a teenager. My parents had never, not once, mentioned anyone named Edith. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe it was for someone else. But then I saw my parents' signatures at the bottom of the certificate, clear as day. I felt this wave of confusion. Who was Edith? Why didn't I know about her? And why was this certificate buried in the attic like some kind of secret? I took the certificate downstairs, where my parents were sitting at the kitchen table sorting through old photo albums. They looked up when I came in, and immediately, I could tell something was wrong. My mom's face went pale, and my dad suddenly looked 10 years older. What is this? I asked, holding up the paper. Neither of them answered right away. My mom's eyes welled up with tears, and my dad just stared at the floor, his jaw tightening. Finally, he said, "Where did you find that?" "In the attic," I said. "Behind the trunk." "Why didn't you tell me I had a sister?" My mom started crying quietly, and my dad shook his head. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Who is Edith? Why is this the first time I'm hearing about her?" My dad rubbed his temples, like the question physically hurt him. "It's complicated," he said finally. That was all he gave me. Complicated. I kept pressing them, but they wouldn't say another word. My mom just cried harder, and my dad muttered something about it being a long time ago. The more I pushed, the angrier I got. I stormed out of the house, the adoption certificate still clutched in my hand. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the certificate, trying to make sense of it. I'd never seen my parents so shaken. They'd always been open about everything, at least, I thought they had. Now I was starting to wonder what else they might have kept from me. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. The adoption certificate listed an agency, Bluegrass Family Services. I found their website and gave them a call. A woman named Marla answered, and I explained what I'd found. "Can you check your records for me?" I asked. Her name was Edith Mooney. My parents adopted her in 1978. There was a long pause. "Hold on," Marla said. "Let me look that up for you." I could hear her typing in the background. A few minutes later, she came back on the line. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, "but we don't have any record of an Edith Mooney in our system." I frowned. That can't be right. I have the certificate right here. It's got your agency's name on it. "I understand," she said. "But our records are very thorough. If there had been an adoption, we'd have it on file." Her tone was polite, but I could tell she thought I was mistaken. I thanked her and hung up, more confused than ever. Why would there be a certificate if there was no record of the adoption? And why were my parents acting like this was some unspeakable tragedy? I went back to their house later that day, determined to get answers. My dad opened the door, and the look on his face told me he knew I wasn't going to let this go. "I called the adoption agency," I said as I stepped inside. "They said there's no record of Edith." "So what's going on? Did you forge the certificate?" My mom, who had been sitting on the couch, started crying again. My dad sighed and gestured for me to sit down. "No," he said. "We didn't forge it. But there's a reason the agency doesn't have any records." He paused, like he was trying to find the right words. Edith was real, he said finally. But the adoption, it never went through. I stared at him. What do you mean it never went through? You adopted her. The certificate says so. It was a mistake, my mom said quietly, her voice shaking. A horrible mistake. They told me everything. Back in 1978, my parents had been trying to have kids for years with no success. When they found out about a baby girl who needed a home, they were overjoyed. They went through all the paperwork, met the baby, and even brought her home for a few days. They named her Edith and started planning their life as a family of 3. But then, just days later, the adoption agency called. There had been a mistake. The baby's biological mother had changed her mind and wanted her back. My parents were devastated. They had to return Edith, and just like that, she was gone. We didn't know what to do, my dad said. It felt like losing a child. We couldn't talk about it. It was too painful. My mom added, we kept the certificate because it was all we had left of her. I didn't know what to say. I'd expected some kind of scandal, maybe even a lie, but not this. Not this kind of grief. My parents had been carrying this pain for decades, and I'd had no idea. But even as I tried to process what they'd told me, one question lingered in my mind. What had happened to Edith? Where was she now? I couldn't stop thinking about Edith after hearing my parents' story. Knowing they had loved her, held her, and then lost her to some bureaucratic mistake or a biological mother's change of heart, it just didn't sit right with me. I could see the pain in their eyes when they talked about her. It wasn't just a loss, it was a wound they'd buried but never healed from. But there was a part of me that didn't trust everything they'd said. Something felt off. Why keep the adoption certificate? Why never speak about her for decades? Why not try to find out what happened to her? They hadn't even mentioned trying to reach out to the agency after the adoption fell apart. It was almost like they'd accepted the situation too easily. So, I decided to do what they couldn't, or wouldn't. I needed to find Edith. I started by digging deeper into the agency, Bluegrass Family Services. The woman I spoke to on the phone had told me they had no record of Edith, but that didn't feel right. I did some research and found that the agency had been involved in a few shady practices back in the 1970s and 80s. There were whispers of forged documents, rushed adoptions, and, in some cases, children being lost in the system. It seemed like their records weren't as clean as they claimed. I found an online forum for people who'd been adopted or had adoption stories that didn't add up. I posted about Edith, explaining what I'd found and asking if anyone had experience with Bluegrass Family Services. Within a few hours, I got a private message from someone who said their adoption had also gone through that agency and that they'd uncovered records the agency claimed didn't exist. She told me to check local archives and court records from the 70s. Sometimes agencies didn't keep proper documentation, but courts often did. A week later, I struck gold. I found an old court document buried in the Jefferson County archives. It wasn't an adoption record, it was a custody hearing. The biological mother of Edith, a woman named Susan Dillard, had been fighting to keep her child. The agency, however, had already placed Edith with my parents before the court ruled in Susan's favor. The document mentioned that the agency had been fined for improper placement practices, but there was no follow-up on what happened to Edith after she was returned to her biological mother. I couldn't stop now. I tracked down everything I could about Susan Dillard. She had died in 1994, but I found out she'd lived in a small town in Indiana, just across the state line. She'd been married and had 2 other children after Edith. That gave me hope. Maybe Edith, or whatever her name was now, was still out there. I kept searching. It was weeks of frustration, dead ends, and sleepless nights. Finally, I found her. Edith, or rather, Margaret Thompson, was living in Evansville, Indiana. She was 45, married, and had 3 kids of her own. I stared at her Facebook profile for hours. Her life looked happy. Pictures of her with her family, smiling at barbecues, hiking in the woods, celebrating birthdays. She looked like a person who had no idea her life had been stolen and rewritten by forces outside her control. I sent her a message. It was short, polite, and to the point. I told her who I was, what I'd found, and how I believed we were connected. I didn't expect a reply. I wouldn't blame her if she thought I was crazy. But a week later, she messaged me back. We met in person a month later at a coffee shop halfway between Louisville and Evansville. Margaret was cautious but curious. I brought the adoption certificate, the court documents, and everything I'd uncovered about Bluegrass Family Services. She listened quietly as I explained what had happened to my parents, how they'd loved her and lost her, and how I'd found her after all these years. When I was done, she sat back and let out a long breath. I always knew something wasn't right, she said. My mom, Susan, used to get really emotional when I asked about my early years. She'd say she did what she had to do to keep me. But she never explained what that meant. We talked for hours. Margaret told me about her childhood, how Susan had been a loving but overprotective mother. It was clear she'd had a good life, but there were gaps, things Susan had never talked about, like why she'd been so insistent on keeping Margaret away from her biological father, or why she'd avoided anything related to adoption. By the end of our meeting, Margaret agreed to meet my parents. She said she wanted to see the people who'd loved her first, even if only for a short time. The reunion with my parents was emotional, to say the least. My mom couldn't stop crying, and my dad, who's normally a stoic guy, actually broke down when he hugged Margaret. She was gracious and kind, but I could tell she was overwhelmed. My parents told her about the days they'd spent with her, how they'd loved her like she was their own, and how losing her had been the hardest thing they'd ever gone through. Margaret didn't say much, but she promised to stay in touch. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't. A few months later, I got a call from Margaret. She sounded upset. "Garrett, I've been looking into Bluegrass Family Services, like you suggested," she said. "And I found out something awful." She'd hired a private investigator, and what they uncovered made my blood boil. Bluegrass Family Services had known all along that Susan Dillard wasn't fit to raise a child. She'd been battling addiction at the time and had only regained custody because her lawyer found a technicality. Worse, the agency had pressured my parents to take Edith home before the court had officially signed off on the adoption, knowing full well it might fall through. Margaret's voice shook as she told me this. "They took me from your parents and handed me back to a mother who wasn't ready for me. I could have had a completely different life. A better life. It wasn't just a mix-up or bad luck, it was negligence." Bluegrass Family Services had played fast and loose with people's lives, and my parents had been collateral damage. Margaret and I were furious, and we knew we couldn't let it go. Margaret and I teamed up. We gathered every piece of evidence we could find, court records, testimonies from other families who'd been wronged by the agency, anything that showed a pattern of negligence and corruption. We reached out to lawyers, journalists, and advocacy groups. We made noise, and we didn't stop until people started listening. Bluegrass Family Services tried to brush it off at first. They claimed the agency had reformed since the 70s and that any wrongdoing was ancient history. But the evidence we'd collected was damning. When the media picked up the story, more families came forward, sharing their own horror stories about lost or stolen adoptions. It was a scandal that rocked the community. Eventually, the agency was forced to shut down. The state launched an investigation, and the people responsible for the mistakes that ruined so many lives were finally held accountable. It wasn't enough to fix what had been done, but it was something. A small measure of justice for my parents, for Margaret, and for all the other families who'd been hurt. My parents still think about Edith, Margaret, every day. They've built a relationship with her, and while it's not the same as raising her, it's a connection they never thought they'd have. As for me, I've gained a sister I never knew I had and the satisfaction of knowing we fought back against the people who hurt my family. Revenge isn't always about getting even. Sometimes it's about making sure no one else has to suffer the way you did. And that's exactly what we did.